The moment I opened the living room door, my heart sank like a stone in cold water. The piano was gone. Every polished surface, every worn key, every note I had poured into it over the years was gone. I had left it there that morning, the sun just starting to slant through the curtains, and by the time I returned from a brief errand, it had vanished. A note sat on the counter, casual in its placement, but lethal in its message. Sold. I couldn't breathe at first. I read it again, then again, as if repetition could reverse reality. She had sold it. My own daughter. The one I had nurtured, taught, guided. The one I had poured years of love and devotion into. The money, they said, went to a vacation. A trip she had been dreaming about. A pang of disbelief struck me. How could the child who once sat on my lap, tracing the keys as I played the song I wrote for her mother the night she died, have such disregard? The piano had not been just an instrument. It was memory made tangible, a living monument to love lost and love given. I remembered that night vividly. The glow of the lamp above the piano, my hands aching from writing each note, translating grief into melody, hoping she would understand, someday, the depth of that loss and the permanence of that love. I had hoped she would see the music, not just hear it, feel the care behind each chord. And now it was gone, vanished, replaced with the distant sound of someone else's laughter and the echo of betrayal. Questions swarmed in my mind. Had she understood what it meant? Had anyone convinced her that it was merely an object, a thing to be traded for pleasure, a commodity detached from memory and duty? I could not tell. I only knew the horror of seeing a piece of my heart, the instrument that held my sorrow and my devotion, reduced to a transaction I was neither consulted on nor approved. I felt humiliation rise, sharp and bitter. How could a parent be invisible in their own home, replaced by the whim of the child they raised? My chest ached, and the quiet of the empty room mocked me. I had spent decades teaching, guiding, and protecting, yet here was a tangible proof of disregard. My piano, gone. The very keys that had traced the path of grief for her mother, that had marked birthdays and milestones with quiet songs, were now strangers in a stranger's hands. A slow, chilling thought crept in. Had she acted alone? Or had someone planted this idea, nudged her toward this betrayal? The suspicion gnawed at me, intertwining with sorrow and disbelief. Could a young adult so detached from gratitude, so easily persuaded, truly comprehend what she had destroyed? Or had she been guided, intentionally or unwittingly, to see the act as harmless, even justified? I sank into the nearest chair, staring at the space where the piano had lived. My hands, once steady in composing melodies, trembled with rage restrained by shock. I remembered the late nights spent coaxing the notes out of the silence, the hours of patient instruction, the careful repairs I had performed when wear and tear threatened its soul. Each memory now felt like a wound freshly reopened, each recollection a reminder of care rendered invisible. The house felt impossibly large, empty, without the gentle resonance of the piano. It was as if the walls themselves mourned, the echoes of lost music reverberating against bare spaces. I could almost hear the song I had written for her mother, each note suspended, waiting to be played, unheeded, misunderstood. And in that silence, a moral outrage began to take root. This was not mere carelessness. It was betrayal. The violation was not simply of my property, but of trust, love, and memory. My grief was compounded by the realization that nothing I had done, no lesson, no demonstration of devotion, had been enough to prevent this fracture. I closed my eyes, imagining her face as she used the money to escape, to indulge, to take what was mine and call it hers. And I asked myself, quietly, desperately, what would you feel if someone sold the object that held your most personal memory? My answer hovered in the cold air, an ache of disbelief and sorrow that would not abate. The piano was gone, but the weight of what it represented, the love, the loss, the betrayal, remained, heavy and relentless. I breathed, trying to steady myself, to grasp what had been taken, not merely for the sale, but for the subtle message it carried, that my devotion could be ignored, my labor invisible, my grief irrelevant. And in that heavy moment, I understood that this was only the beginning of reckoning, the first echo of a pain that would demand acknowledgement, truth, and ultimately, reflection. The house was quieter than ever, and I realized that the loss was not just of wood and strings, but of trust, a breach that would reverberate through every note I had ever played, every memory I had ever preserved. I had loved, and that love had been sold for leisure, for selfish indulgence, for a disregard I could scarcely comprehend. I looked at the empty space, feeling the absence like a hand gripping my chest. My heart ached for the music, for her, for the life that had been silently eroded by one seemingly simple yet devastating act. And in the depths of that sorrow, I knew this was a wound that would not heal easily, a betrayal marked not in words, but in silence and lost melody. The piano was gone. The song remained untaught, unplayed, and unacknowledged, a testament to love turned invisible, and a filial bond broken in the most tangible way possible. The grief was sharp, the betrayal complete, and the moral weight settled like a stone in my chest, pressing me into the reality of a trust shattered beyond repair. I remember the night I wrote the song as though it were yesterday. The house was quiet, except for the faint hum of the heater and the soft rustle of paper as I carefully traced each note. Her mother had just passed, leaving a silence that seemed to settle in every corner. I wanted to capture her memory, not just in words, but in music, a living testament that could be played, remembered, and cherished. The piano became more than wood and strings. It became a vessel for grief, love, and continuity. I spent hours crafting the melody, choosing each note with care, testing it over and over until it resonated the way I felt inside. Each chord was a heartbeat, each pause a breath held in memory of a life that had been so abruptly taken. When I finally finished, I sat back and listened in the stillness, feeling a connection to her that transcended words. This was a song not just for her, but for my daughter, a bridge between generations, a legacy she could touch and carry forward. When she was old enough, I began teaching her to play it. I can still see her small fingers trembling over the keys, her brow furrowed in concentration, her eyes lighting up the moment she struck the right chord. Her laughter filled the room the first time she played the tune without mistake, pure and unguarded, a reflection of the innocence and trust I had known. Those moments were brief windows into a future I hoped would remain unbroken, a bond stitched together with music and memory. Every lesson, every repetition, was a labor of love. I corrected her gently when she faltered, praising effort over perfection, encouraging patience and devotion to the song, as I had learned devotion to life itself. In those evenings, beneath the soft glow of the lamp, the piano was more than an instrument. It was a teacher of resilience, a keeper of stories, a constant in a world that could feel perilously unstable. Yet even as I nurtured her skill, subtle changes began to appear. She would sigh impatiently after mistakes, her attention wandering, small distances forming in her gaze. It was never blatant, just fleeting. A pause here, a distracted smile there, but enough that I felt the first tremors of emotional distance. I tried to bridge it with more music, more stories, more shared quiet, but each attempt met a wall I could not see. I now understand that those early signs were the beginning of a shift, a slow drift of perception that I could not have prevented. The same hands that learned to play her mother's song with joy were, over the years, taught to prioritize other voices, other pressures. And in that unspoken curriculum, the memory, the love, and the effort embedded in every note began to lose its sacredness in her eyes. I reflect on those hours of teaching, of coaxing music from her small fingers, and feel a protective heartbreak. How could the same child who once marveled at the beauty she could create from grief now act without regard for the care, time, and emotion invested in her upbringing? The piano and the song it carried were more than possessions. They were the essence of love, translated into melody, and yet that essence was now disregarded. Even in the face of betrayal, I cannot erase the memory of her wonder. I remember the concentration in her eyes, the small triumphs, the way she would laugh when a chord rang true. Those memories remain etched, untainted by the act that has so recently shattered my sense of trust. They remind me that for a time, she knew the depth of love behind each note, even if she no longer acknowledges it. And so the piano, the song, and the hours spent together exist in my memory as both treasure and wound. I feel sorrow for what has been lost, empathy for the pressures she might not have recognized, and a protective heartbreak for the innocence and joy that have been overshadowed. Each note I hear now carries both the weight of remembrance and the sting of betrayal. A song that sings for her, for me, and for the mother she never truly knew in life, but whose love we tried to preserve in music. It started quietly, almost imperceptibly. At first, she merely postponed piano lessons, claiming schoolwork or tiredness, but soon the excuses became a pattern. I noticed the small shift, fewer smiles when I entered the room, eyes that flickered away instead of meeting mine, a hesitance in conversation that had never been there before. It was subtle, like the first cracks in a window pane, easy to ignore until the whole surface shivered with tension. I tried to reach her with patience, reminding myself that adolescence carries its own turbulence, that a child's mind can twist intention in ways a parent cannot anticipate. Still, each avoidance, each delayed response, pressed on me with a heaviness I could not shrug off. My guidance, once embraced with trust and wonder, now seemed to be interpreted as criticism, as an attempt to control or restrict. The first real confrontation came unexpectedly. She accused me of being overbearing, of making her follow rules that were meant to teach discipline and respect. I remember the sharpness in her voice, the confusion in her eyes. She tried to justify her feelings. I felt my own guilt rise, questioning whether I had been too rigid, too insistent, too absorbed in my desire to preserve our shared memory of her mother's song. Yet beneath that self-doubt lingered the quiet knowledge that my intentions had been rooted in love and protection. It became impossible to ignore the widening distance. The conversations we used to have about music and life, about patience and perseverance, were replaced with curt answers and long silences. Even when I suggested new songs or creative exercises, her enthusiasm faltered, replaced with an air of obligation. I realized that her perception of my guidance had shifted, transformed into a perceived imposition rather than the support it was meant to be. There was a gnawing suspicion in me that someone close to her had begun to influence her understanding. Friends, her new circle, or perhaps her own interpretation of life outside our home, could have whispered ideas that distorted the reality she once knew. I tried to untangle these threads quietly, to understand where her resentment and caution had taken root. But every answer seemed to open a new question, every explanation revealing a deeper layer of misunderstanding. Despite the growing estrangement, I could not let go. I continued to offer guidance, soft encouragement, and opportunities for connection, knowing that my responsibility was not contingent on immediate gratitude or recognition. The moral weight of being a parent, of protecting and teaching despite resistance, pressed heavily on me. I questioned my every word, my every expectation, but I also recognized that my efforts were born from a place of steadfast care. The tension accumulated with each passing day. I watched her interact with the piano, seeing the hesitation, the restraint, the subtle avoidance of my presence. Each note she played felt filtered, measured, distant. The instrument that once sang with joy and trust now echoed the silent chasm growing between us. I mourned the loss of intimacy, the laughter, the shared victories, even as I struggled to maintain a balance between guilt and justified responsibility. I tried to remind myself that this was not entirely her fault. Misunderstandings had grown over time, nurtured by inexperience, outside influences, and perhaps her own desire to assert independence. Yet the result was unmistakable, a widening emotional gap that left me unsettled and fearful for the bond we once shared. The girl who had once embraced her mother's song with delight now regarded it with a mixture of obligation and indifference. Each encounter left me reflecting on the limits of my influence. I questioned whether I had done enough to foster understanding, to communicate the intentions behind my guidance, and to shield her from misinterpretations. Still, even in that uncertainty, I felt the moral responsibility to continue, to offer patience, support, and a reminder that my love and dedication had never wavered, regardless of how it was received. The estrangement was gradual but undeniable. It stretched between us like an invisible wall, composed of unspoken resentments, misunderstandings, and perhaps whispered influence from elsewhere. My sorrow was coupled with fear that the foundation of trust and love we had built might erode entirely, leaving only distance where connection once thrived. And yet, I held on, quietly determined to maintain my role as both guide and guardian. even as the gap widened with each passing day. I received a call I wasn't expecting from someone I barely knew, but who had been present at one of her recent music gatherings. The voice was cautious, careful, almost apologetic, as if speaking to me would somehow reopen old wounds, but I needed to hear what they had to say. They had observed her closely over the past months, noticing behaviors I could only sense but could never fully confirm. The avoidance, the tight smiles, the quick glances away when I entered a room. They had seen it all. They described the pressure she carried, a burden of expectations that had built gradually, layer upon layer, unnoticed by anyone who wasn't looking closely. Secrecy had become her armor. She masked the anxiety that bubbled beneath her composure. Each note played on the piano, each practice session, held a subtle tension that I had felt but could not name. Hearing it articulated by an outsider hit me with a mix of relief and heartbreak. I was not imagining the distance, nor the weight she bore. The observer provided a timeline, matching the moments when her smiles had become fleeting, when her eagerness to share music dimmed, when she began deflecting my invitations. It was a cruel confirmation. The emotional distance I had feared had been forming steadily, an invisible tide I had failed to notice until it was nearly too late. They suggested gently that influences outside our home had played a role. Friends, her partner, even passing comments from her peers might have altered her perception of me, painting my concern as criticism, my guidance as control. The possibility that her bitterness was not entirely her own choice made my sorrow heavier. The heartbreak of seeing a child misled, misinterpreting care as constraint, weighed on me in a way I could hardly bear to admit. I felt a hollow ache as they recounted her efforts to protect me from her own stress, how she concealed fears of disappointing others, how she wrestled internally with loyalty and shame. Each revelation sharpened the sting of betrayal, yet also brought the strange comfort of validation. My instincts had been right. The distance I sensed, the subtle shift in our bond, had not been imagined. In that conversation, I realized the cruel clarity of perspective. From the outside, the patterns were clear, but inside, I had been blinded by familiarity and love. I had assumed her smiles meant comfort, her polite refusals were mere fatigue, when in truth, she was navigating a complex web of pressures I could not fully access. The observer's words peeled back layers I had not dared to examine too closely, forcing me to confront a reality I had feared. Sorrow settled into me like a cold weight. I mourned the ease of connection we once had, the laughter that had flowed freely over shared music, the spontaneous moments of closeness now replaced with guarded politeness. Yet even in that grief, there was a subtle lesson. The truth, however painful, carries the power to guide actions with clarity and resolve. I reflected on my own role in this unseen turmoil. Had I done enough to shield her from outside influence? Could my guidance have been communicated more clearly, more gently, so that my intentions were unmistakable? I wrestled with these questions silently, aware that answers might never be fully known, and yet driven to understand, to empathize, and to protect. The observer's testimony lingered in my mind long after the call ended. It was both confirmation and indictment. Confirmation that my concerns were valid, that my love had not blinded me entirely. An indictment of the forces shaping her choices and perceptions without my knowledge. The piano, the song, the countless lessons, all had been caught in a cross-current of pressures I could not control. Even as I absorbed this painful clarity, I felt the moral weight of responsibility pressing on me. I could not undo the influences she had absorbed, nor could I erase the misunderstandings that had grown between us. But I could act with honesty, patience, and protective care, even if she could not yet recognize it. The sorrow and validation intertwined, leaving me with a quiet, heavy determination. It was the most heartbreakingly lucid moment I had faced in years. The truth of her struggle, the unseen forces guiding her, the gap between intention and perception, and the realization that sometimes, even when you act with love, the world can twist your efforts into something unrecognizable. Would you trust an outsider who saw your child struggle more clearly than you did? I remember sitting alone after that conversation with the observer, the weight of their words pressing down like a hand I couldn't lift. They had confirmed what I had only suspected. Someone in her life, her partner, a friend, perhaps even colleagues, had painted me in a way that made concern look like control. Guidance seemed like pressure. Hearing it articulated clearly brought both fear and outrage. Fear for how much influence others could wield over her feelings. Outrage that the love I poured into every lesson, every patient explanation, had been reframed into a narrative that now drove a wedge between us. It was subtle at first. I could see how their words, repeated with conviction over time, could distort memories. My advice about music, the late nights spent teaching her to play her favorite songs, the gentle corrections that were always meant to encourage, all had been misread, through a lens I could barely identify at the time. The observer explained how these misperceptions had compounded, feeding into her growing sense of self-blame and distance. I realized, painfully, that she had been caught between two worlds. On one side, the loyalty to her own life, her choices, her growing independence, her desire to live without feeling scrutinized. On the other, the shame and obligation toward her past, toward me and the history we shared, complicated by narratives that were no longer hers alone. It was a delicate and cruel balancing act, and I could see how it had forced her into decisions that betrayed both sides of her heart. Every memory I had of teaching her now carried a shadow. The piano, the evenings spent writing her mother's song together, the small, secret encouragements I gave when she doubted herself, all of it had been filtered through stories that I had no control over. My internal conflict surged. Do I confront her with the truth, insist that she understand, or do I step back to protect her from the added burden of disappointment in me? The right path felt impossibly unclear. I replayed moments in my mind, trying to identify where the narratives had begun to twist. Was it a casual remark from her partner, meant in jest or offhand, that lodged in her mind? Or was it the consistent framing by friends who never knew the full story, who only saw a fragment and assumed control? Each possibility made my heart heavier. I knew that the root of her resentment was not born from malice, but from a complex web of half-truths and misinterpretations. As the observer had noted, these false narratives were powerful. They shaped her understanding, altered her emotional responses, and guided her actions in ways I could not undo. Recognizing this filled me with a deep sense of moral outrage, not at her, but at the unseen forces that had manipulated her perspective and distorted her relationship with me. My love and intentions had become invisible to her, replaced by shadows cast by others. I found myself grappling with the balance between defense and care. Every instinct urged me to assert the truth, to protect my legacy, to clarify the reality of my sacrifices. Yet a greater, quieter instinct reminded me that pressing too hard might break her further, that her emotional safety had to come before my own need for acknowledgement. It was a paradox I could not easily resolve. How to stand firm without shattering her. The sorrow of this realization was immense. Watching a child's perception of you be molded by forces beyond your control is a unique and bitter grief. I felt each moment I had invested in her as both precious and painfully vulnerable. The value of my dedication now entangled with someone else's misrepresentations. And yet, even in this mixture of fear, outrage, and sorrow, I felt a protective surge. I would not abandon her to these false narratives completely. I would find ways to remain present, quietly supportive, without fueling conflict. I could no longer rely on understanding to be immediate. Patience and moral guidance would have to be my tools, tempered by the knowledge that the truth alone could not always rescue a relationship already shadowed by deception. The lesson was brutal and humbling. Love can be misconstrued, guidance misrepresented, and devotion misread, yet the responsibility to protect and support remains. And so, I sat in quiet reflection, recognizing the forces that shaped her choices, the resilience I would need to maintain, and the unwavering commitment to her well-being, even when the path forward was shrouded in misunderstanding. I asked her to sit with me, just for a moment, in the quiet corner of my living room, where the piano had once been the center of our shared evenings. I had chosen the spot deliberately, hoping the familiar comfort of the space might soften the walls that had grown between us. The soft afternoon light fell across the room, but it did nothing to ease the tension I felt pressing against my chest. I started carefully, recounting the years I had spent nurturing her love for music, the nights we had shared over keys and sheet music, the patience required to teach her the song I had written for her mother. I wanted her to see not just the effort, but the intention behind each note, each correction, each whispered encouragement. It was not control, it had been devotion, love translated into melody. Her eyes were distant, wary. As I spoke, I watched the walls she had built subtly shift, but not enough to let my words through. When I mentioned the piano's sale, her face tightened, and her voice, soft at first, grew defensive. "I didn't mean anything by it," she said, repeating phrases that had been fed to her over time, about me being controlling, about how I supposedly stifled her choices. I could feel the weight of each misinterpreted action pressing down on both of us. I reminded her gently of the sacrifices, of the late nights, of the small ways I had sought to make her life richer, not more constrained. But each sentence seemed to bounce off her walls and fall into the empty space between us. She was overwhelmed, a flood of emotion rising, anger mixed with shame. Yet I could see the fear beneath it, the fear of confrontation, the fear of admitting she had misunderstood. Her repetition of the false narratives was relentless, each one a knife, carving further the distance that had grown between us. It was clear she wasn't ready, or perhaps willing, to face the full truth. My explanations, no matter how precise or heartfelt, could not compete with the voices that had long since influenced her perspective. I felt a stab of grief, realizing that my intentions, once pure and guiding, had been twisted into something that now repelled her. I tried to reach for a bridge, some common ground, some point of connection where truth and understanding could meet, but it was like grasping smoke. The more I tried, the more it eluded me. The room felt heavy with unspoken words, with the history of misread gestures and misunderstood care. I saw the sorrow behind her eyes, the conflict tearing at her conscience, yet it could not override the barriers that had formed over time. In that silence, I began to acknowledge a painful truth. Some boundaries were necessary, not as punishment, but as protection. Protection of my dignity, of my heart, and of hers. I could no longer demand understanding where she was not ready to give it. I could no longer risk further harm by pressing for clarity that would only cause more pain. This was not surrender. It was a measured acceptance of reality, a recognition that love sometimes requires stepping back. The room, filled with the echoes of the piano that was no longer there, became a symbol of the distance that had grown. Each lesson, each shared melody, each moment of joy now carried the bittersweet weight of absence and misunderstanding. I felt the slow ache of disappointment settle over me, tempered by the clarity that boundaries, though painful, were necessary to preserve what remained of our relationship. I left that conversation with a heavy heart, the knowledge that reconciliation might not come, at least not yet, and perhaps not on the terms I had hoped for. And yet, even in that sorrow, I found a quiet resolve to protect what I could, to honor the love and memory embedded in each note of the song I had written, and to carry forward with dignity, even when my intentions were unseen and misunderstood. I watched her hands twist nervously in her lap, the room silent except for the faint hum of the street outside. She looked at me, really looked, and for a moment I thought I saw the weight of years settle into her shoulders. Then her voice broke, soft and trembling, as she admitted the truth I had long suspected but feared to name. She had misunderstood so much, judged so many of my actions incorrectly, and allowed shadows of fear and confusion to shape her behavior. Her words landed heavy, each one a mirror reflecting the distance that had grown between us. She spoke of how someone close, a partner, a friend, someone she trusted, had painted me as controlling, someone who limited her choices, rather than as a father who sought only to guide and protect. The misrepresentation had lodged itself firmly in her mind, altering her perception of every kind act, every small sacrifice I had made for her. I felt sorrow first, a deep ache for the lost closeness, for the years spent under silent tension, for the moments of joy now overshadowed by doubt. Her confession, tentative and trembling, stirred both empathy and grief within me. I could see the fear that had driven her, the shame that had silenced her, and the pain that had fueled her distance. It was not cruelty, nor was it deliberate disregard. It was the burden of misbelief, compounded by external voices that sought to sway her understanding of me. As she continued, I recognized the subtle ways her resentment had grown from fear, from misunderstanding, from feeling trapped between loyalty to her own life and the distorted image of me that had been fed to her. Every hesitation in her speech, every downcast glance, confirmed the truth. Her bitterness was not born from hatred, but from a misinformed heart trying to reconcile conflicting loyalties. And yet, as I listened, another layer of grief settled over me. The painful awareness of how limits of influence can be cruelly apparent, no matter how patient, how consistent, how deeply loving. There are moments in a child's life when even the most devoted parent cannot bridge the gap between intention and perception. I had taught, guided, and nurtured, yet there were fractures I could not mend, wounds that formed without my knowledge, and misunderstandings that hardened over time. Our shared silence became a language of its own, heavy with mutual recognition of the wounds we carried. I could see how my desire to protect her had been misread as control, how my insistence on guidance had been interpreted as restriction, and how the love behind each action had been lost beneath layers of fear and external influence. The tragedy was not her intent. It was the consequence of unseen pressures and unspoken fears. Her confession stirred a quiet anger, not toward her, but toward the circumstances and the voices that had manipulated her perspective. I felt the moral weight of witnessing a loved one's integrity shadowed by false narratives. Yet within that anger was clarity, a painful understanding of the limits imposed by her own perception and by the external forces she trusted. I realized that even love, even sacrifice, cannot always shield a child from misinterpretation, nor can it prevent the shaping of character by influences beyond my control. In that room, the fragile connection between us seemed to shimmer for a moment, held in tension between acknowledgement and regret. We were both aware of the mutual wounds, both burdened by the unspoken history that neither fully understood. And though sorrow was thick in the air, I found a tragic understanding in knowing the difference between malice and misperception, between deliberate cruelty and the mistakes born of fear and pressure. I left that conversation carrying a quiet, somber weight. I knew the path forward required patience, reflection, and acceptance of boundaries I had once resisted. The lesson was stark. Love and sacrifice, no matter how absolute, are sometimes limited in their power to shape understanding. And in that recognition lay both grief and a fragile clarity, a comprehension of the human complexity that defines even the closest family bonds. The piano sat in the corner of the living room, its polished wood gleaming softly under the afternoon light. Yet it felt hollow to me now. The keys, once a conduit of laughter and music, a vessel of memory for her mother's song, were gone, replaced by absence. I ran my fingers along the empty space where the instrument had rested, imagining the melodies that once filled the air and the small moments of joy it had sparked in our home. Each note I had written, each chord she had learned, carried a history of love, of care, of nights spent teaching her the song I had written for the woman she would never know in life, yet would always carry in memory through music. I thought about the choices before me now, the decision of whether to reveal the truth about the piano, about what it had meant, or to let the silence linger, unbroken, preserving the world she had built from her assumptions. The thought was heavy. To speak might offer understanding, might bridge the chasm that had formed between us over years of miscommunication and unseen sacrifice. Yet it also carried the risk of shattering her perception entirely, of replacing the fragile piece she had crafted with confrontation and guilt. Memories of her learning to play, her small, unsteady hands pressing the keys, her eyes wide with wonder, collided with the bitter knowledge that she had used the piano's value for her own escape. I felt a deep sadness, not merely for the loss of the instrument, but for the symbolic destruction of trust and shared history. Each note, each memory, was gone, and with it, a part of our connection that could never be reclaimed. I reflected on my own role in the unfolding story, the ways my love and patience had been met with misunderstanding, the subtle miscommunications that had grown into distance. Even the most careful, deliberate care can be misinterpreted. Even the most heartfelt sacrifices can be obscured by assumptions, external influence, and the inevitable gaps of perspective that separate parent and child. The moral weight of that realization pressed on me, reminding me that some lessons are learned only through experience, often at a cost too heavy to measure. And yet, within the sorrow, I found quiet strength in acknowledging the limits of influence, in understanding that love does not guarantee gratitude, that sacrifice does not ensure recognition. Strength in knowing that dignity is preserved not only through actions taken, but through choices made with clarity, even when the outcome is heartbreak. I had the power to choose my response, to maintain boundaries, and to protect the remnants of what had been mine to safeguard. The silence in the house was not empty. It was a testimony. It spoke of devotion, of music shared and lost, of a bond tested by human frailty and circumstance. It held the echo of lessons taught, of love unspoken, and of the moral clarity that comes when one sees the consequences of another's actions without allowing them to erode one's own integrity. I breathed in that quiet, letting the weight settle, not as defeat, but as acceptance. I considered the long view, the possibility of stepping back, of allowing her to live within the understanding she had formed, however flawed, without imposing correction. Perhaps it was better to preserve the peace she believed she had, rather than challenge her with the full truth and risk fracturing what remained of our relationship. The decision was mine, and in it lay both sorrow and dignity. As the day faded into evening, I stood by the empty corner where the piano had rested, letting the shadows lengthen. There would be no reunion, no restitution that could undo what was done, no words that could reconstruct the music of the past, only the reflection of what had been, and the quiet resolve to honor the lessons of patience, love, and the limits of human understanding. I would preserve my boundaries, uphold my dignity, and carry forward the bittersweet acceptance of a story unfinished, a song unplayed, and a silence that would speak for itself. Should he reveal the truth, or let silence preserve the world she believes?